Malcolm X, the American hero history tried to erase. Before the world knew him as Malcolm X, before the speeches, before the global headlines, there was a child named Malcolm Little, born into a divided America that would shape him long before he tried to change it. Malcolm Little was born on May 19, 1925, in Omaha, Nebraska, at a time when the United States openly enforced racial segregation through law, custom, and violence. This was an America where opportunity was not distributed equally, and where black families who challenged that system often paid a severe price. His father, Earl Little, was a Baptist minister and an organizer who supported black self-reliance and economic independence. He was also a follower of Marcus Garvey's movement, which encouraged African Americans to take pride in their heritage and resist racial subjugation. This ideology, focused on dignity and independence, made Earl Little a visible target. The Little family lived under constant threat. White supremacist groups were active in the Midwest during the 1920s, and black political organizing was often met with intimidation or violence. Family records and later testimonies describe harassment, threats, and destruction of property. Their home was reportedly burned while Malcolm was still a child, forcing the family to relocate more than once. In 1931, when Malcolm was just 6 years old, his father was found dead on a streetcar track in Lansing, Michigan. The official ruling labeled the death an accident. However, family members and historians have long noted inconsistencies surrounding the case. What is historically verifiable is this. Earl Little's death removed the family's primary provider and destabilized their lives permanently. Malcolm's mother, Louise Little, struggled to keep the family together under intense financial pressure. Despite her resilience, the combination of poverty, systemic discrimination, and lack of institutional support took a heavy toll. By 1939, Louise Little was committed to a state mental hospital, and the children were separated and placed in foster homes. For Malcolm, this separation marked a turning point. He was intelligent, articulate, and academically capable. Teachers recognized his abilities, and he performed well in school. But the social reality of the time was unforgiving. In one well-documented account from Malcolm's later life, he recalled being discouraged from pursuing professional ambitions despite his academic performance, a reflection of how limited black aspirations were expected to be. By his teenage years, Malcolm was living apart from his family, moving between foster homes and relatives. Eventually, he relocated to Boston, where he was exposed to urban life, economic struggle, and the informal survival economies available to young black men with limited options. This period of Malcolm's life is sometimes oversimplified or sensationalized. Historically, it is better understood as a reflection of structural realities rather than individual failure. Employment opportunities for black youth were scarce, educational advancement was routinely blocked, and social mobility was severely constrained. Malcolm took on various jobs, some legitimate, others less so. He worked as a shoe-shine boy, a waiter, and in service positions common for black youth at the time. These experiences placed him in close contact with both the promise and the limits of American society. By the early 1940s, Malcolm had dropped out of formal education. His life moved further away from the stability he once showed potential for, not because of a lack of intelligence or ambition, but because of a system that offered few sustainable paths forward. This chapter of Malcolm's life is critical to understanding his later transformation. It shows a young man shaped by displacement, loss, and exclusion, but also by observation. Malcolm learned early how power operated, who possessed it, and who was denied access to it. There was no dramatic turning point yet. No ideology, no movement, only a young black American navigating an unequal nation, absorbing lessons that would later define his voice. What makes this stage of Malcolm's life historically significant is not tragedy alone. It is context. His early experiences mirror those of countless Americans whose names history never recorded, but whose lives were shaped by the same forces. Malcolm Little did not emerge from nowhere. He was formed by America itself, by its laws, its silences, and its contradictions. And this is where the story truly begins. In 1946, at the age of 21, Malcolm Little's life entered a decisive chapter, not through public recognition, but through confinement. He was arrested in Boston, Massachusetts, and later convicted on charges related to burglary. He received a sentence of 8 to 10 years in state prison. This moment is often reduced in popular summaries to a simple turning point, but historically, it represents something more complex, a period of enforced isolation that became an unexpected gateway to education, discipline, and intellectual awakening. Malcom was incarcerated first at Charlestown State Prison and later transferred to Norfolk Prison Colony, a facility known for its relatively extensive library and educational programs. Prison life was rigid, monotonous, and unforgiving. Malcom himself later described his early months behind bars as marked by anger, frustration, and frequent disciplinary conflicts. However, it was also during this time that Malcom encountered a sustained intellectual challenge for the first time. Through letters from family members, particularly his siblings, Malcom was introduced to the teachings of the Nation of Islam, a religious and social movement that emphasized moral discipline, self-respect, and communal responsibility among African Americans. At the center of its philosophy was the idea that Black Americans should reclaim dignity in a society that systematically denied it. Importantly, Malcom did not adopt these ideas immediately or uncritically. Historical accounts from his own writings and prison records indicate a gradual process, one defined by reading, reflection, and self-confrontation rather than instant conversion. Malcom began reading obsessively. At Norfolk Prison Colony, he gained access to a large library. He read dictionaries, history books, philosophy, literature, and works on religion. One frequently cited and verifiable account describes Malcom copying entire dictionary pages by hand to improve his vocabulary and writing skills. Whether taken literally or symbolically, the documented reality is clear. Malcom used reading as a method of self-reconstruction. This intellectual discipline reshaped how he understood the world and himself. He studied American history in depth, particularly the historical experiences of Black Americans and colonized peoples globally. He read about slavery, Reconstruction, imperialism, and the global racial hierarchies embedded in modern history. These readings did not make him radical overnight, but they gave structure and language to questions he had carried since childhood. By 1948, Malcom had fully committed to a personal transformation. He abandoned previous habits, adopted strict personal discipline, and embraced the teachings of the Nation of Islam. As part of this shift, he rejected his birth surname, Little, which he viewed as a legacy of enslavement rather than a chosen identity. He replaced it with X, a symbolic placeholder representing a lost ancestral name erased by slavery. This was not a performative gesture, but a philosophical one, grounded in the movement's teachings about identity and historical rupture. Malcom's time in prison was not spent preparing for celebrity or leadership. There is no evidence that he anticipated a national role. What prison gave him was clarity. Clarity of speech, clarity of purpose, and a disciplined intellectual framework. Fellow inmates recalled Malcom as articulate, intense, and increasingly focused. Prison records and correspondence show a man who was transforming not through spectacle, but through routine, reading, writing, debating, and self-control. By the early 1950s, Malcom was recognized within the Nation of Islam's correspondence network as a committed and capable individual. He wrote letters, engaged in religious study, and refined his ability to communicate ideas clearly and persuasively. When Malcom was released from prison in 1952, he did not return to his former life. He stepped into a different America, one that was beginning to experience early tremors of the modern civil rights movement, though its most visible moments were still years away. Upon release, Malcom officially took the name Malcolm X. His transformation was not framed as redemption in a traditional sense. It was reconstruction. He had rebuilt himself through education, discipline, and ideological commitment at a time when few institutions expected incarcerated Black men to emerge with intellectual authority. This chapter of Malcom's life is essential for understanding his later influence. It reveals that his command of language, his sharp analytical style, and his disciplined presence were not accidental traits. They were developed deliberately, under restricted conditions, through sustained effort. Prison did not make Malcom famous. It made him formidable. It gave him the tools to articulate lived experience within a broader historical framework. It allowed him to speak not only from emotion, but from study, and it positioned him to become one of the most compelling communicators of his era, not through charisma alone, but through preparation. When Malcolm X walked free in 1952, he carried no illusions about America, but he carried something else: knowledge, structure, and a voice sharpened by years of disciplined silence. The public would soon hear that voice. When Malcolm X was released from prison in 1952, he entered a nation quietly approaching a period of profound social transformation. The United States was experiencing post-war economic growth, yet racial segregation, housing discrimination, and employment inequality remained deeply entrenched. For many African Americans, everyday life was defined by limits imposed not by law alone, but by custom and enforcement. Malcolm did not emerge as a public figure immediately. His early years after release were marked by discipline and organizational work within the Nation of Islam. He relocated to Detroit, where the movement's national headquarters was located, and quickly distinguished himself through diligence, clarity of speech, and organizational ability. Under the leadership of Elijah Muhammad, the Nation of Islam emphasized moral reform, economic self-sufficiency, and communal accountability. Its teachings rejected integration as a primary goal, instead promoting separation and internal development as a response to systemic racism. These ideas were controversial, but they resonated with African Americans who felt excluded from mainstream civil rights strategies of time. Malcolm X became one of the movement's most effective ministers, not because of theatrics, but because of preparation. He studied doctrine carefully, memorized historical arguments, and refined a speaking style that was direct, structured, and precise. His speeches avoided improvisation. They were methodical, often built on historical examples and observable social conditions. By the mid-1950s, Malcolm was appointed minister of Temple No. 7 in Harlem, New York. Harlem at that time was a center of black cultural life, but also a community affected by overcrowded housing, limited employment opportunities, and aggressive policing. Malcolm's presence there placed him at the intersection of national media attention and local lived experience. Attendance at Temple No. 7 increased significantly under his leadership. Membership growth during this period is documented in contemporary reporting and internal movement records. Malcolm also helped establish new mosques in other cities, expanding the Nation of Islam's national footprint. This expansion brought visibility and scrutiny. Malcolm's public statements were often quoted in newspapers and broadcast on television, sometimes selectively and without context. His critiques of racial inequality challenged the dominant narrative of gradual reform and integration. Yet historically, his language remained focused on diagnosis rather than incitement. He described conditions as they existed, using sharp language rooted in documented realities. Throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, Malcolm became one of the most recognizable black public figures in the United States. He participated in debates, gave interviews, and responded to questions from journalists who often approached him with skepticism or hostility. What distinguished Malcolm during this period was his refusal to soften his analysis for comfort. He spoke plainly about housing segregation, employment discrimination, and police misconduct, issues that were statistically and historically verifiable, even if rarely acknowledged openly at the time. Importantly, Malcolm did not position himself as a lone figure. He consistently framed his role as that of a spokesperson, not a singular leader. His speeches emphasized collective responsibility and institutional change rather than personal charisma. As the civil rights movement gained national attention through boycotts, marches, and court rulings, Malcolm's role existed in parallel rather than opposition. He acknowledged the efforts of other activists while maintaining that different strategies addressed different realities. His critiques were ideological, not personal. By 1963, Malcolm's influence had reached beyond religious audiences into global political awareness. International journalists sought his perspective on American race relations. Foreign governments observed his commentary as a reflection of internal U.S. contradictions during the Cold War, when American claims of democracy were increasingly scrutinized abroad. However, with visibility came internal tension. Malcolm's prominence sometimes eclipsed that of the organization itself, creating friction within the Nation of Islam's leadership structure. Historical records indicate disagreements over communication strategy, media engagement, and organizational authority. These tensions were not sudden, nor were they rooted in a single incident. They developed gradually as Malcolm's public role expanded. Despite this, Malcolm remained publicly loyal to the movement during this period. His speeches continued to reflect its teachings, and he adhered to its internal discipline. The year 1963 marked a critical moment. Following the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, Malcolm made a statement using a metaphor that was widely reported and criticized. The Nation of Islam suspended him from public speaking for 90 days. This disciplinary action, documented in contemporary accounts, significantly altered Malcolm's relationship with the organization. The suspension did not immediately end Malcolm's involvement, but it created space for reflection. For over a decade, Malcolm X had functioned as an institutional voice, sharp, disciplined, and defined by collective ideology. Now he faced a pause. For the first time since his release from prison, his public silence forced a reassessment of his role, his beliefs, and his future direction. This chapter of Malcolm's life is essential not because it presents a finished philosophy, but because it shows a man operate within structure, building influence through organization, language, and discipline rather than impulse. By the end of 1963, Malcolm X was nationally known, internationally observed, and internally conflicted. The voice America had come to recognize was about to change, not in volume, but in scope. By early 1964, Malcolm X stood at a crossroads shaped not by publicity, but by reassessment. His separation from the Nation of Islam marked the end of an institutional role that had defined more than a decade of his public life. What followed was not an abandonment of principle, but a deliberate widening of perspective. Malcolm's first major step was travel. In April 1964, he undertook a pilgrimage to Mecca, a journey that placed him among Muslims from across Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. This experience exposed him to religious practice beyond the racial framework he had previously known. In letters and interviews from this period, now preserved in historical archives, Malcolm described praying alongside people of many ethnic backgrounds, unified by shared belief and ritual. The significance of this moment lies not in conversion. Malcolm was already Muslim, but in expansion. He observed social interaction that contradicted the racial absolutism he had previously accepted. This observation did not erase a critique of American racism, but it complicated it. Following his pilgrimage, Malcolm traveled extensively throughout Africa and the Middle East, visiting countries such as Egypt, Ghana, Nigeria, and Algeria. These trips were documented by journalists and diplomats who recorded his meetings with political leaders, intellectuals, and students. Malcolm framed these encounters not as symbolic gestures, but as educational exchanges. During these travels, Malcolm increasingly articulated the condition of Black Americans as part of a global human rights issue, rather than solely a domestic civil rights concern. This shift is historically documented in his speeches and interviews from late 1964. He spoke about colonialism, economic exploitation, and international law, drawing parallels between struggles abroad and conditions at home. Importantly, Malcolm did not present himself as a representative of foreign governments or ideologies. He emphasized learning, observation, and dialogue. His language during this period became more precise, less absolutist, and more analytical. He acknowledged complexity without retreating from critique. Upon returning to the United States, Malcolm founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity, OAU. The organization was modeled in part on international human rights bodies and sought to address issues such as education, voter access, and economic opportunity through community organization and international awareness. The OAU was short-lived, but its intent is historically clear. Malcolm envisioned an institution that combined grassroots engagement with global perspective, an approach that differed from both mainstream civil rights organizations and his former religious affiliation. During this final phase of his life, Malcolm's public speaking reflected a notable evolution. His tone became measured, his arguments more inclusive. He openly acknowledged learning from others and emphasized cooperation across differences where shared goals existed. This evolution did not mean retreat. Malcolm continued to speak candidly about racial violence, inequality, and structural injustice. However, he increasingly framed solutions in terms of collective human responsibility rather than fixed divisions. Public reaction to this shift was mixed. Some supporters welcomed the broadened vision. Others were uncertain or skeptical, interpreting change as inconsistency rather than growth. Historically, Malcolm addresses directly, stating that growth required reassessment, and reassessment required honesty. By early 1965, Malcolm X was again speaking frequently, meeting with young activists, and engaging with the press. His schedule was demanding, and he was aware of potential risks. Yet historical records show no evidence of fatalism. He continued to plan, organize, and speak about future initiatives. This chapter of Malcolm's life is often condensed into a brief epilogue. That reduction misses its significance. Here, Malcolm X emerges not as a finished icon, but as a developing thinker, someone willing to revise conclusions in light of new evidence. His final year demonstrates intellectual humility paired with moral clarity, a combination rarely acknowledged in simplified portrayals. Rather than abandoning his earlier convictions, Malcolm reframed them within a broader human context. He moved from a language of separation toward one of shared accountability, without minimizing the realities that demanded accountability in the first place. This was not a departure from struggle. It was a refinement of purpose, and it would define how history ultimately remembers him. On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X arrived at the Audubon Ballroom in New York City to address a public meeting. He was 39 years old. What occurred that afternoon ended his life, but it did not end his influence. The immediate historical record is clear. Malcolm X was fatally shot while preparing to speak. He was pronounced dead shortly after. The event was widely reported, investigated by law enforcement, and documented in contemporary media. His assassination shocked supporters and critics alike, marking the abrupt close of a public career that had evolved rapidly in its final years. What followed was not silence, but reassessment. In the days after his death, memorial services were held in Harlem, attended by community members, activists, and observers from different ideological backgrounds. Coverage from a period reflects a complex response: grief, disagreement, admiration, and unresolved questions about how Malcolm X should be understood. Over time, one fact became increasingly evident. His work could not be reduced to a single phase. Malcolm's legacy is anchored in documentation rather than myth. His speeches, interviews, letters, and collaboratively produced autobiography of Malcolm X form a substantial historical record. Together, these sources show a life marked by development rather than rigidity. He changed positions when evidence and experience demanded it, a trait that distinguishes historical thinkers from static symbols. In academic study, Malcolm X is now examined across disciplines: history, sociology, religious studies, and political science, not as a caricature, but as a case study in American transformation. Scholars analyze his evolution from institutional spokesperson to independent human rights advocate, noting how his later ideas anticipated international frameworks that would gain prominence decades later. His impact is also visible in education. Universities include his writings in curricula focused on American history and social thought. Museums and archives preserve recordings and documents that allow researchers to trace his arguments precisely in his own words, without editorial simplification. Importantly, Malcolm X's contribution does not rest on unanimity of agreement. Disagreement with his conclusions has always existed, and that disagreement is part of the historical record. What remains consistent is recognition of his discipline, intellectual rigor, and refusal to speak beyond evidence he believed he could defend. In public memory, Malcolm X is often contrasted with other civil rights figures. Historically, this framing obscures more than it clarifies. Malcolm himself acknowledged multiple approaches to addressing injustice, emphasizing that different conditions require different strategies. His work added analytical depth to national conversations rather than replacing existing efforts. Internationally, Malcolm X is remembered as an American figure who engaged the world seriously. His meetings abroad and his articulation of global context positioned domestic inequality within a broader human framework, an approach now common in modern historical analysis. Today, his words continue to be cited, not as slogans, but as primary sources. When used responsibly, they offer insight into the psychological and structural dimensions of inequality in mid-20th century America. When removed from context, they lose that value. Historical responsibility requires the former. What history has sometimes minimized is not Malcolm X's visibility, but his intellectual discipline. He prepared carefully. He revised publicly. He documented his thinking. These traits make his work durable long after the circumstances that produced it have changed. Malcolm X did not claim to be a finished answer. He presented himself as a participant in an ongoing human conversation, one that demanded honesty, study, and moral accountability. That is why his legacy endures. Not because history tried to erase him, but because history continues to require the questions he insisted on asking. If this documentary expanded your understanding of American history, subscribe for more real stories that deserve careful telling. Comment with what part of Malcolm X's journey stood out to you most. And share this video, because history only stays alive when we pass it forward.